Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Engaging Diverse Voices in Adaptation Planning Processes. I'm Cameron Hunter, a policy analyst at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which acts as the Secretariat for the Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, or the PRAC. For those of you who haven't heard of the PRAC before, it's a cost-shared program between the governments of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Natural Resources Canada, and it aims to increase the capacity of government and civil society decision makers on the prairies to understand, prepare for, and take action to address the implications of our changing climate. Today's webinar is the third in a series of 4 webinars hosted by the PRAC. Each of the sessions in this webinar series explores topics relevant to the theme of building the resilience of communities to the multiple shocks and stressors, including those associated with climate change. During our first session on building climate resilient communities, we heard about the importance of proactive adaptation planning and the need to engage stakeholders in this planning. Then, in our second session on building resilient food systems, we heard from our panelists about how one key element of building a resilient food system is engaging with community members. Both webinars emphasize the importance of building trust and social connections with partners and community members, delivering information and programming in a culturally appropriate manner, and learning from the experiences of others as an important components of resilience building. Today's webinar gives us a very exciting opportunity to explore these issues in greater depth. To view the recordings of the last 2 webinars and to learn about future webinars in our webinar series, please visit the PRAC website at prairiesrac.com. While this event is being held virtually, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently in Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would now like to turn the webinar over to our moderator for today, Angie Dawsey, who is a Senior Policy Advisor and Gender Equity Lead at IISD's Resilience Program. Angie, over to you.
Thank you, Cameron, and welcome to our guest speakers and everyone in attendance today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation about engaging diverse voices in adaptation planning processes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you today from Ottawa, which is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Although we know that adaptation planning processes are more effective when they're participatory and inclusive, the reality is that many such processes are undertaken without broad engagement of the people who may be affected by the decisions that are made. In this session, we're going to explore why diverse voices are needed to inform adaptation planning and highlight the importance of engaging those who are often left out of decision-making processes. We would like this session to be as interactive as possible, so we're trying out a new tool. My colleague Julia is sharing a link in the chat box to a site called Padlet. We'll use this to gather questions and comments throughout the webinar. I hope you'll join us in trying it out. It's actually the first time we're using it, but we think it has great potential. You don't need to create an account or provide your details. You can just go to bit.ly/PRAC10, which is PRAC in all caps, and you'll be able to join the conversation. And as I said, Julia has also shared the link in the chat box. When you reach the Padlet site, you'll see that we've set up 5 channels, one for introductions, one for questions for our keynote speaker, Amber, one for questions for our panelists, another discussion channel focusing on the success factors for engaging diverse voices in adaptation planning processes, and finally one for general comments and feedback on the discussion. And just to note, the boxes ask for a title and a comment, but you can just type your comment in the title space if that's easier. So please do hop on the Padlet, and to start the conversation, I would encourage you to introduce yourself and let us know where you're joining us from today. And just to note that we'll be using the Padlet channels to direct questions to the speakers in the discussion portion later on in the session. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Amber Fletcher, who will be providing an opening presentation to frame our conversation today. Dr. Fletcher is an associate professor of sociology and social studies at the University of Regina. She's also the academic director of the Community Engagement and Research Center. Amber's research examines how gender and social inequality shape the lived experience of climate change through the lens of climate disasters such as flooding, drought, and wildfire. Influenced by her upbringing on a rural farm in Saskatchewan, her work focuses on rural and Indigenous communities in the Canadian Prairie region. She works to help amplify the voices of people who are highly affected by climate extremes and to reveal the lived impact of social inequality in the context of crisis. Amber, I'm so happy that you could join us today and share your perspectives. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much to ISD for the invitation, to Angie for the introduction, and to all of you for being here today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I would like to begin by giving a brief talk on the importance of diversity in adaptation planning. So next slide, please. Okay, so we all know that climate change is unfortunately resulting in increased risk of wildfire, flooding, drought, and other climate-related disasters. We know that the frequency and severity of these events will continue into the future as climate change proceeds. And although we often hear about how we are all in this together, and we often hear of entire communities or regions being affected by a disaster, it's really important to acknowledge that not everyone within those communities or regions is affected equally or the same when a disaster hits. And this is because climate change related disasters, the impacts of climate change, interact with existing forms of social inequality that already exist in the social body or the society that's being affected. And so it's really important to acknowledge the different nuances and context-specific experiences that people have depending on their social location within various systems of inequality. Inequality may exist along the lines of gender, culture, race, class, or socioeconomic status, SES, sexuality, ability, age, location, many other different factors that shape people's experiences of a disaster in very specific ways. And what's important further to recognize is that this disproportionate vulnerability, or this particular form of vulnerability that's felt by people belonging to certain groups or certain social locations, is not some kind of inherent characteristic of the person or the group. Vulnerability is a product. It is something that is constructed because social inequality exists in that society. And fortunately, for that reason, vulnerability is something that can be addressed and changed. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do today is to highlight some of the different ways that the intersecting effects of different forms of inequality can have on people's experiences of climate disasters. And I'd like to give you a few examples from some of the research, including some research that I've been doing with my own research team. We know that heat waves are increasing in frequency and severity because of climate change, and many regions around the world are susceptible to heat waves, including some areas in Canada as well. We also see from the research that older women tend to be disproportionately at risk from heat waves. This is because of the intersection of a few specific characteristics that cause older women to be more vulnerable. Over a lifetime, women on average earn less money than men. This means that women on average are more likely to live in poverty in their older years compared to their male counterparts. This particular interaction of gender and socioeconomic status with age leads to the disproportionate vulnerability of older women who may be more likely to live in low-income housing, substandard housing, and generally housing where there's not access to air conditioning. Similarly, we see these same interactions operating in the case of flood disasters. Women being more likely to live in low-income housing, mobile or trailer homes, basement apartments, do tend to be more at risk because they lack those financial resources to live in more flood-resilient housing. We've seen in many cases of flood disasters around the world that because women are disproportionately responsible for the care of others, for children, the elderly, people with disabilities, people who are ill, that they are less likely to be able to evacuate because they have responsibilities other than just themselves. this can result in disproportionate fatality rates for women in some flood disasters. And again, really illustrates that intersection of gender and how gender shapes the experience of a particular event. That being said, it's important to recognize that gender does not just equal women. And in fact, some of the emerging research that my own team has been conducting, as well as research coming from other contexts like Australia, has shown that because of masculinity, because of gendered expectations that men will be heroes and risk takers, men are much more likely to be the ones rushing into a flood disaster to try to save people, property, livestock. And as a result, some flood disasters have actually shown extra fatalities amongst men because men are expected to be heroes. So it's these constructions and expectations that we associate with women and with men, and which ultimately lead as well to the exclusion of people whose identities don't fit the gender binary, that we see very different experiences of disasters, the immediate coping, but also the ability to adapt over the long term, a point that I'll return to in just a few moments. In other disasters like droughts, my own research, as well as research coming out of Australia, for example, has shown that because women on farms tend not to be seen as the primary farmer or the main farmer on the operation, they are less likely to have an influence over coping and adaptation decisions. Women, because they are not seen as farmers in many cases, are less likely to be making decisions like, should we spend extra money on that drought-resistant seed? Or should we hold off on that equipment purchase until next year because this year is looking dry? So women are not put in the position of being adapters, but they are put in the position of being supporters. And so we see this when a drought disaster hits a rural community. It's women on farms and in rural communities who are expected to hold their families and their communities together with emotional support. So these are the gender dynamics that we see specifically at the intersection of gender and rural location, because the challenges farm women face in the event of a drought are very different from that of women in urban areas, for example. Other intersections that we've seen in the research in the case of wildfire evacuation include the intersection of culture or indigeneity with age and with family status to create very different experiences for people in Indigenous communities. Research on the Hatchet Lake evacuation by Sharbach and Waldron has shown that because provincial evacuation authorities during that particular disaster did not necessarily understand Indigenous definitions of family, families were inadvertently to the authorities separated when they should have been kept together. Elders who were seen as more vulnerable were separated from their communities when their communities needed them the most. Research from my own team on the L'Orange wildfire evacuations of 2015 has shown that Indigenous mothers who had been evacuated to urban centers like Saskatoon and Regina often feared that their children would be apprehended from them, a concern that probably would not be experienced by women from other social locations. And research from the United States has shown that a similar lack of recognition for gay and lesbian families has meant that families were separated because their status as a family was not recognized during the evacuation. So homophobia, sexuality, gender inequality, histories of colonization and racism, all of these things interact and come together in very specific ways to create nuanced and context-specific experiences of a disaster. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share with you a few quotations, the voices of participants in my own research projects that I think illustrate these diverse experiences. So as I mentioned before, some of the women we interviewed in the context of the L'Orange wildfire evacuation noted that they were afraid their children would be apprehended from them. Of course, this experience was shaped by histories of colonization and wrongful apprehension of children by authorities, overrepresentation of children, Indigenous children in the foster care system, and many other social factors that ultimately led to women, mothers who had been evacuated, fearing that their children would be taken from them. One woman said to us, even your own anxiety as a person that was sober and trying to also protect your own children, your anxiety level went up because it was like, if my kids start behaving, are they going to call the authorities on me? End quote. Next slide, please. We also see the effect of socioeconomic status or class in how people experience disasters. Our research in Maple Creek has really shown the relevance, the pertinence of socioeconomic status in influencing people's ability to cope and to adapt when a flood disaster happens. During the flood of 2010 in Maple Creek, participants in our interviews talked to us about how people living in mobile homes were very vulnerable and in fact saw their homes literally float away from them when the flood hit. Participants told us about mobile homes crashing into each other like bumper cars, with people unable to do anything about their homes literally floating down a stream of water. For others who lived in standalone single-family homes of other kinds, adaptation depended so much on how much money you had. For some people who had money, it was very possible to rebuild, to repair, even if the insurance wasn't enough or the disaster relief wasn't enough. But as one participant told us, and I quote, people were going into the bank and throwing their house keys on the counter and walking out saying, it's yours. They had no choice. What are you going to do? People who had money, they jacked their house up. They rebuilt and kept it, end quote. So socioeconomic status also makes a difference. Next slide, please. Socioeconomic status, the amount of financial resources a person has to respond, to cope, and to adapt over the long term makes a difference in their ability to withstand current and future disasters. I'd like to give this example of how the intersectional wage gap has implications for adaptation. We see here not only in the table, not only the gendered wage gap, where all women in Canada in aggregate earn approximately 75% of what men in aggregate earn on average per year. But when we start adding in intersecting categories of difference, even within the category women, like Indigenous women, newcomer women, women with disabilities, we see that in fact that pay gap relative to what men on average earn becomes more and more severe and distinct. So this very tangible example of access to financial resources, the amount of money a person has to cope and respond to a disaster, certainly affects their vulnerability and adaptive capacity. At the same time, I've been talking a lot about vulnerability, and I think it's really important to note that even though inequality does tend to exacerbate vulnerability, it is very important to recognize the value, the contributions of people who come from more marginalized social positions. As Cameron pointed out in a very important 2012 article on Indigenous knowledge, she argued that it's very important to see Indigenous knowledge about the environment, about the climate, about ecosystems, not as merely local knowledge, but as knowledge that actually has the ability to change how we think about the environment and the world around us. Similarly, my own research with farm women has shown that because of women's relative disempowerment on the farm, they actually have a more critical perspective on agriculture and some definite thoughts on how we can do agriculture differently and perhaps better. Next slide, please. One woman in one of my studies, for example, said, and I quote, "We women don't want to wreck the world. You want to keep it for your children. You got to think of the 7 generations before and the 7 generations to come. You don't just think about yourself." I think this quote illustrates the value of diverse perspectives, the value of learning from those who experience disasters in a particular way, and the value of listening to those whose voices are far less often heard. For example, next slide. We also heard from participants in the research about how to do evacuation differently. So it's not just about long-term adaptation, but also about how to do evacuation in more culturally sensitive and culturally safe ways. So one man from the Lac La Ronge Indian Band told us, and I quote, "I do support the Red Cross, but they shouldn't have total control. It's like residential school mentality, like staying in jail or being in prison," end quote. And so this quote for us really revealed, again, the importance of considerations like not putting people that have survived residential school on a cot in a facility where they're told when to wake up, when to go to sleep, when to eat, and when to shower. And it's considerations like this, the importance of agency, the importance of individual and community level freedoms for people to do evacuation in a way that works for them, that we are reminded of if we listen to the voices of those who are most affected. Next slide, please. And so I'd like to conclude with just a few recommendations, and I'm sure we'll have so much more discussion on these as we go forward. But I would like to suggest that rather than seeing participatory adaptation planning and inclusion as just something we should do because it seems right, to actually conceptualize participatory planning as a right to participate. Communities, community members, particularly those who are marginalized within a community, have the right to have their voices heard and taken up and meaningfully included in adaptation planning. Doing so can facilitate more collaborative, inclusive forms of governance. It can show, importantly, respect for knowledges that are not as often heard or heard from or integrated into planning. It can also identify potential areas where adaptation could go wrong, where it might not be taken up well by the community for a reason that an external person might not see. And it can also identify potential areas of maladaptation, where adaptation goes entirely in the wrong direction and actually reinforces problems like social inequality. Next slide, please. And so a few very concrete considerations. If you are doing adaptation planning and you'd like to do it in a more inclusive way, some things to consider. Consider the time of day. Ensure that the time of day will work for those who are perhaps most marginalized or those who are least able to participate in the current manner. Consider the invitation process and getting the invitation out in maybe more unconventional ways. Are there newspapers that or newsletters that cater to specific communities or to people speaking a specific language? Have you provided childcare? If not, could you? Are the locations accessible by bus, by public transit? And are they accessible for people who use wheelchairs, for example? Are our communication practices inclusive? Are they colonial or decolonial? Do they follow a very rigid structure that may not be amenable to people from various cultures? And is our language inclusive of non-binary gender identities, for example, and for those who may not speak English as a first language? These are just some very practical considerations that we can take into account to make planning not only more participatory, but more inclusive and ultimately more beneficial to everyone. So with that, I'll conclude. The next slide shows my contact information if you'd like to get in touch. And thank you so much for listening today. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. You've done such an excellent job of explaining in a very clear way why it's so important to engage diverse voices in adaptation planning processes. And I think that really sets us up for the panel discussion, which is going to look more at the how. How do we actually go about doing this? So just a reminder, if you have any questions for Amber, please do share them in the Padlet and we'll come back to them later in the session. Amber will be staying with us to participate in the Q&A portion following the panel discussion. So thanks again, Amber. Next, I'm very happy to introduce our panel, who will be discussing their experiences with engaging different groups in adaptation planning processes. Panelists, if you're able, it would be great if you could turn your cameras on now. First, I'd like to welcome Amanda Broad, who is a Senior Policy Analyst for Climate Risk Management in the Climate Action Secretariat in BC's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Her team works collaboratively across government and with partners in every region of the province, with the goal of ensuring that British Columbia is prepared for and resilient to the impacts of climate change. Over the past few years, Amanda has led efforts to ensure that engagement is a key foundation of developing a provincial climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. Next, we are joined by Darrell Corkel, who is a water resources engineer and president of H2 Adapt Inc., a consulting company advancing sustainable water resource management and adaptation. Darrell has more than 10 years of experience on international climate change adaptation research, particularly in Chile, and more than 30 years of experience with the Government of Canada's Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, working with agricultural producers, Indigenous nations, rural communities, and international stakeholders on water issues. And last but not least, we are pleased to be joined by Jocelyn Joe-Strack Dakalama, a member of the Wolf Clan of Northwestern Canada's Champagne and Eshihik First Nation. Jocelyn holds a research chair at Yukon University, where she strives to evolve tomorrow's policies by blending yesterday's ancestral lessons with today's systematic knowledge. She uses her experience as a trained microbiologist, hydrologist, and policy analyst, along with her cultural foundations, to explore resilient approaches to challenges such as climate change, societal well-being, and prosperity. Jocelyn's research focuses on youth climate leadership, revitalizing traditional storytelling, and evolving governance systems. So thank you all so much for being here today. And before we start the discussion, just a reminder to please post any questions you have for either Amber or the panelists in the Padlet, as we'll be using this as the basis for the Q&A after the discussion. Julia has shared the link again in the chat if you missed it earlier. And just a note that if you're not seeing all of the comments from others, it can be helpful to refresh your browser, and that should show you the whole discussion. So to get us started, I'd first like to ask each of the panelists to briefly describe the process you'll be talking about, where different groups were engaged in the assessment of climate vulnerabilities or planning of adaptation actions. Jocelyn, let's start with you. Can you please tell us about the process you've been involved in the Yukon?
Sure. Goodness cheese, thank you, Angie. And so just quickly, Angie Dawsey. I'm Jocelyn Joe-Strack from the Champagne and Ajax First Nation. I'm here in Whitehorse, Yukon, which is on the ancestral lands of the Kwanlundun and Ta'ankochen nations. And I'm in my new office at the university, so it's very bare here. But I'm very grateful to be here and to have the opportunity to share with you. I have been working as a consultant prior to becoming a research chair, and with the Yukon government to develop their climate risk assessment. And part of the point of the risk assessment is to come to understand what it would take to be resilient to the impacts of climate change by 2030, which is not very far. And so we worked really hard as a team to create a different type of process, we hope, that focused a little bit more on resilience and the will and abilities of people in the Yukon, and really trying to reframe climate change as a social challenge as opposed to a natural environmental one.
Thanks so much. Next, we'll go to Darrell. Can you please tell us about the Saskatchewan flood and natural hazard risk assessment process, and particularly the stakeholder engagement component?
Yes, I better unmute myself. Hopefully my audio is coming through clear. Thank you, Angie. Excuse me, my name is Darrell. I'm actually a civil engineer, but I've done a lot of work in the past with engagement through work with PRAC with farmers, as well as working with academics on climate change and adaptation research. The Saskatchewan project was a multi-agency research project, and it was largely driven by the Ministry of Government Relations interest in trying to better understand the risks that Saskatchewan is facing with natural disasters, fires, floods, drought. So my role on that, even though I'm a civil engineer and natural scientist in that sense, my role was largely to create and work with the engagement sessions. We had 6 regional sessions, and the Saskatchewan Ministry of Government Relations viewed this study essentially as a social science study. How are people in communities actually in Saskatchewan at risk to natural disasters, and how are they coping, and how might climate change affect them into the future? So we held 6 regional workshops, and the government asked us to target those who would be decision makers that might influence the ability to deal with floods, fires, and droughts, and how are they coping. And so we invited regional communities, rural municipalities, respected associations, including political leaders, knowledge experts, operators, and so on. In addition, First Nations communities, tribal councils, their leadership and operators, government nations from all orders of government, local, provincial, and federal, again, including subject matter experts ranging from disaster risk response, emergency preparedness response, health, agriculture, infrastructure, water, energy utilities, transportation, climate, and environment. Academia and subject matter experts were also involved in those respective areas of interest, including engineering, agriculture, and disaster risk response. Various industry groups as well, the forestry, mining, ag sector players, energy, oil and gas, road and rail transportation, and obviously also non-government organizations, watershed groups, environmental groups, irrigation groups, emergency management, insurance responders. It was a really diverse study. Now, these invitations were mailed out and by email and by phone. Not everyone attended, of course, but we did have about 200 over the course of the 6 workshops. We basically set up 3 short presentations in the morning on one day that talked about fire, flood, and drought, and then broke out into scenario discussions, workshops, and interactions. And then the afternoon with one presentation on climate change and how that might actually impact natural disasters into the future. And so it was a very productive workshop because we got diverse input from a variety of interests.
Great, thank you. Amanda, can you tell us about the process that the government of BC has been engaged in over the last couple of years to develop its climate preparedness and adaptation strategy?
Yes, happy to do so. Just before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, represented today by the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. I'm just down from the traditional salmon reef net fishing area, and also that I just want to recognize that it's also the home of the Greater Victoria Métis Charter community. And also shout out to Treaty 6, because that's where a lot of my family is as well. Maybe to go over setting the foundation. So in 2018, our province released the Clean BC plan, and that set out the pathway to reduce emissions and build a sustainable economy within the province of BC. As a key kind of deliverable under that, there was a commitment to develop a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. And that really has informed all of our work moving forward. And so from around June 2019 until this past summer, we've been on a really interesting process of engagement that has been informed a lot by what we've heard from communities. And so it's constantly evolving and we learn more, and we're always looking for different ways to reach different populations. But it really started with first reaching out and doing regional sessions with Indigenous populations and to hearing from them about what the communities are experiencing in terms of impacts, also where the challenges were and where the strengths really were and where the province could play a role. And then moving from there into kind of a more public engagement process and reaching out through libraries and friendship centers and Métis Nation and through communities to have different unique ways of reaching out to everyone to hear their views, and to also have online platforms with discussion forums and lots of hard copy and online surveys. And all through that time, we are also trying to really meet people where they're at and attend any event that we could attend, and whatever that may be. And it was really an exciting journey in terms of having conversations about the changing climate in elders gatherings or at the Legion or different places wherever kind of that emerged throughout the province, as well as conferences and workshops. And then we were kind of on the verge of doing really exciting in-person engagement, and COVID hit. And so then we had to reconfigure and try to be creative in our approach and really mindful about what that was going to look like when the added stress of the COVID-19. And so had lots of really exciting workshops online. And I wouldn't normally say that because we all have Zoom fatigue, but we tried different approaches in terms of using things like breakout rooms and like graphic facilitators and lots of storytelling to try to engage people and really build strategy through engagement.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to come back to Darrell. When we spoke earlier about the process in Saskatchewan, you mentioned that using visuals was really helpful in engaging people in conversations about risk and vulnerability. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, when we organized the workshops, we really wanted to help the stakeholders think about the subjects that we were going to discuss during the breakout groups. So to do that, we obviously had your standard PowerPoint presentations with your normal types of data that you would show with how climate change, for example, might be impacting, or what a fire, flood, or drought looks like. And of course, people could relate to that, but it was basically just to help them think about the natural disaster by actually seeing it. We also produced posters that we put up in the room, but really simple ones where we would have a big picture that dominated the image, whether it be a fire, a flood, a drought, or impact on people, animals, or infrastructure. There were obvious impacts that you could see, and then very limited text. So they were not text-heavy kinds of posters. It was a desire on our part and a deliberate strategy to pick relatable images, relatable in the sense that it either came from their region or from the province itself in a way that they could relate to it, both present and past. The present, I should say that when we conducted this survey, it was in 2017 spring, and the province had been through 6 years of abnormally high and wet conditions. So people could very easily and automatically gravitated to relating to flood impacts, because somewhere in the province you could find someone who was affected by flood, whether it was south or north. But then we used images to capture near history, and by that I would say within the last 5 to 10 years. So droughts in 2001 and 2002, which were extreme, we were able to show pictures of impacts, both economically with graphs and or just visuals that would show the land and the crops being impacted. So the natural disaster, but also its impact on people. The whole concept of this was, I think, and we didn't have a ton of information, but it was just information that we teased out and left on tables, and at the breakout groups were copies, for example, obtained from websites of newspaper stories or insurance articles, short things that people could scan at, read, and see the picture or the buzz line and the headline. All of these were useful features to enable the discussions. And then the discussions were structured around an interview guide to basically tease out from the stakeholders their local knowledge and intelligence on what their vulnerabilities are, how strong their resilience is, what their coping mechanisms are to these disasters, and to tell their stories, how they're mitigating or adapting to this, usually basically looking in near history, or perhaps sometimes as long as the droughts back down to the 1920s and 30s, where they would draw on stories that might have come from grandparents or great-grandparents in historic memory. So basically all these visuals were helpful in storytelling, and they were designed in a way to encourage the conversation and build on the scenarios that we were discussing with them in the breakout groups. And we did receive some very, very rich data.
Excellent, thanks. And I just want to acknowledge that there's quite a lot of action happening in the Padlet. So I'm really happy to see that. I'm not reading it, but I can see movement on my other screen. So that's great. Thanks to those who are engaging there. So next I wanted to turn to Amanda. Why was it so important for the BC government to invest in public and partner engagement for the development of the adaptation strategy?
Sorry, always trying to remember to find that mute button. Yeah, so I think that there's a few things that were really informing that. So as I mentioned earlier, like foundational really is making sure that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is part of all of our work. And so really wanting to make sure that that we were going to be developing a strategy that was going to actually have actions that were meaningful to communities, and that we were kind of developing those in partnership was really key to the process. I think that also at the same time, we had the 2017 and 2018 flood and wildfire season in BC, and that I feel like was probably a wake-up call for the province in terms of understanding that, there had been good work really in the natural resource sector to start taking adaptation actions, as well as in looking at infrastructure and looking at kind of the financial aspects. But there hadn't been anything really looking at how people were being impacted as individuals, as communities, what the services that were being impacted were. And as we really learned through that engagement process how much health and well-being were being impacted, And I think we talk a lot about health in terms of like wildfire smoke and asthma, but we weren't talking about what are the mental health impacts that are coming up. And that was a really emerging conversation that certainly our engagement process really brought out, as well as so many incredible, more holistic actions have really come out of the conversations that we had in all of our engagement processes. And if we had continued in terms of more the traditional approaches that we had before.
I think that's such an important point that, you know, it led you in a different direction. It gave you insights that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't undertaken this participatory process. That's so essential. Jocelyn, when we spoke about your work, you mentioned that you really approached the consultations as a process of relationship building. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Amanda, Darrell, and Amber as well for your thoughts and ideas and sharing, because it all lends very well, or I can tell that we're working towards similar things. In the Yukon, you know, we come from a place of strong First Nations leadership and determination. So we have, you know, 11, I think, of the 23 or might be 25 final agreements within Canada in the Yukon. So, and we've been implementing these agreements since 1993. And it started in 1973 when a group of our leaders went to Pierre Trudeau in Ottawa with a message of together today for our children tomorrow. And that is the culture that we are trying to create within the Yukon, that we work together as Yukon people, no matter who you are and where you're from or when you came here, but that the emphasis is to work together for our children tomorrow. Now, how you implement that literally in the bureaucratic administrative context becomes very challenging. And, you know, we struggle now in that we've implemented our agreements to the literal law in the fashion of the Western society, as opposed to really thinking about our partnerships and our relationships. And so as I came into this process as a consultant, I came in not interested in climate change. I came in interested in spirit and intent and together today for our children tomorrow. And so creating opportunities for people to work together, converse together as people, not as administrators or bureaucrats or scientists or technicians, was really quite important. And what it did was it was a privileging of Indigenous space. And so, and it took a little while into the process to realize that this was the need and realize the different type of knowledge that different people were expecting or wanting to give. And so, you know, we had our government technical representatives who really wanted to wear their hats strong as a biologist or a wildfire person or an infrastructure engineer. But what we did was we created space where it was okay to be an infrastructure engineer and okay to be a Yukoner. And it resulted in, we had 2-hour Zoom conversations where we brought in people from multiple different backgrounds. And then we spoke about a scenario. So for example, the highway washing out frequently, what are we going to do? And so, you know, the infrastructure engineer gives his technical sort of responses, but after an hour and a half of creating this open, personal, emotional, spiritual, ceremonial space, we start to move into an understanding of what actually matters, or what can we actually do if the highway is washing out frequently, and what is the real risk of that, and what is the real resilience of us as people working together or willing to work together. And in most of our conversations, our biggest risk was actually our silos and our inefficiencies and our inequities. Thank you, Amber, for your presentation. It was quite good. Because inequity at the bottom of it all is our most vulnerable and our greatest risk, because we are only as strong as our most challenged and our most suffering. And so that's why the relationships ended up becoming quite quite important, and really the key for the project was to break down silos and create bridges, because together that's where will be our most strong and our most resilient. And so, you know, we can create plans for infrastructure, we can create plans for wildfire, but if we're not doing it together, then, you know, it's not as strong as it could be in the end. And so a lot of what this was doing was really just trying to create connections and create space where being emotional and being real and carrying your hat as a professional and as a Yukoner and as a mother or a father, a grandfather mattered just as much. And yeah, it resulted in some really wonderful conversation. But it took people a while. It took people a while to take off their professional hat.
Thanks so much. I love that concept of sort of taking off our hats and meeting each other as humans. I think that's just incredibly important, especially in relation to an issue like climate change. And I think it's amazing that you managed to get there in a virtual environment as well. And I think there's interest from others in hearing a bit more about that. So we'll come to that maybe in the Q&A. So Amanda, you mentioned that you used a lot of creative methods to reach a wide range of people across the province. Can you tell us more about these and some of the concrete things that you've done in the process to bring people into the conversation?
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like I'm going to miss some of the great ideas, and really just want to start by like crediting the amazing team of people that we've worked with. We've just, it's really been informed by so many. And as I mentioned before, like communities have so much to teach, I think, larger levels of like organizations and levels of government about engagement, because we learned so much from others about what was working and what doesn't. Very much early in the process, we were new to the idea of engaging on this topic, and we were looking at different ways. So we, in the regional sessions with Indigenous communities, we were looking at ways that we could move, just knowing that movement and interactivity can help with reducing some of the stress around talking about climate change impacts. And so we had lots of stickers and interactive spaces in that. And then as we kind of continued in our conversations, we did bring things like games into that space. So we did bingo, and we played like more trivia type games as well. We took time to sit in spaces and just listen to people. So for example, we were invited to one event where we just spent 2 days out in the sun and spending time talking to and building those relationships that Jocelyn so like beautifully talks about. Elders gathering, that like I have to say that was one of the most impactful for me. Is just hearing that was one of the first times that they had someone just sit and talk to them about the changing climate and from a provincial government, and how meaningful that was to have those conversations. And a lot of what we learned in those processes definitely informed all of our engagement as we move forward, as well as our actions. When we went into the public engagement space, we wanted to do things a little different, because I think probably many of the people listening to this webinar would appreciate climate change adaptation isn't really necessarily something that is talked about in the public space. We talk a lot about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that adaptation one isn't there. So we tried to get creative. We did different videos that were online. We had hashtags. We had discussion forums with changing questions to try to get people enthusiastic and adding their pieces to that. We worked with the friendship centers and libraries, and as I mentioned, and did things like having hard copy surveys for people to send back to us. And I really got a lot of joy in terms of reading some of those, because people brought their own creativity to that space as well, and shared their stories about how climate change was impacting them. We also had, with the libraries, such a great relationship where they put little cards on top of the computers. So anybody accessing the libraries would know that they could just go to our website and join the discussion or submit something. I think that was a really great way to reach populations that we wouldn't typically reach in terms of an engagement process. Because I think always in the back of our mind as well, we have a commitment to doing our work with the gender-based analysis plus lens on that. And so we were trying to think about different ways that we could really bring in intersectionality and understanding more about how climate change is impacting diverse peoples in different ways into the work. So that was really critical. And then as we kind of were moving out of that and heading into the spring and summer and COVID, really so much credit to our amazing consultants we work with. So we first, in terms of partner engagement and youth engagement, worked with SFU Center for Dialogue, where they created these breakout rooms for discussion, but then also created space at the end where people could connect and share the work that they're doing to build relationships and kind of move forward on momentum that's not just informing the province, which I think was a really important thing. And we also really made sure that in those processes we were thinking about accessibility, because that's a big problem. So really making sure that there's always toll-free call-in numbers, making sure there's capacity funding, especially for youth and elders, but also for communities. And then our summer engagement, Alderhill Planning, I just am so grateful for them really looking at our work, giving us some good, strong feedback in terms of the fact that we were asking too much and that we needed to be more creative in our approaches and turning what we had in terms of the vision for the strategy more into a visual piece where we could tell a story. And that was just so well received. We had people asking for coloring book pages for those beautiful drawings. And in those virtual engagement sessions, we brought music into it for the breaks and also had breakout rooms where it wasn't about the province. It was really about communities just telling stories with one another and having a graphic artist record that. And then other one and taking different approaches to how we would hear back on the actions we were proposing. So using things like Miro boards or just having a room where people could come and speak with the province about anything that they would like to do. And so I'm looking forward to hearing further ideas, but we're planning lots more engagement in the future and really want to find different creative ways to hear from people, because all of these different pieces really have shaped the whole way that we're now seeing adaptation in the province.
Your job sounds really fun, or a lot of it anyway. And I think I love how concrete, you got in thinking about sort of all the different potential barriers to engagement and really trying to find creative ways to lift those barriers. I think that's such an important thing for us to be thinking about as adaptation planners. And I think, a couple of things that have really stood out to me from what I've heard so far are around dialogue, like bringing different people together, and then also storytelling, that these experiences are very personal, and how can we, build from those personal experiences to kind of, chart the pathway forward. So Darrell, I know that the process in Saskatchewan also was trying to sort of bring different actors together in dialogue. So I'm just wondering, you're an engineer, what were the interesting insights that you gained that you maybe wouldn't have thought of if you hadn't used a participatory process? Did those dialogues help you to look at the issues in a different way?
Yeah, totally, Angie. I think it's important to get diverse perspectives for broadening how we think about a problem. I'm convinced that all people, have an implicit understanding of risk management and the need to adapt, and they take measures in their own life based on their own experiences. So as an engineer who worked in mostly agriculture and water supply projects and irrigation and water quality and water treatment, drinking water on the farm, that type of thing, with some experience working with Indigenous nations dealing with difficult to treat water as well, most of my experience has been dealing with water projects, small scale, rural, remote, and the issues related to that, with management of wells or land use practices. So in that sense, I've been often involved with both infrastructure, but also environmental exposure to polluting risk, for example, or risk of pollution from various industry practices, whether it be agriculture or other sources of pollution. But one of the things that I learned by working with some of the stakeholders that I never ever had past experience with, it was the emergency managers or management response teams that deal with fire smart. I mean, I'd never in the past had any experience in dealing with fire related problems, although grassland fires are starting to become an issue right now. And it really struck me how emergency management responders, especially with programs like Fire Smart, where you just basically anticipate and expect fires to occur. It's a natural occurrence. So that natural disaster is something you need to plan for because it might happen. It's not a fiction. It's not a guarantee that it's going to occur, but you need to be ready for it. So what I learned from emergency management responders is through Fire Smart programming, they've got programs, for example, that relate to preparedness planning. It's like a bookshelf plan that their community and their region will have in the event of a wildfire occurring, so that they know how to put into practice that response plan. And we thought about this as a relationship to the natural disasters that people spoke about related to excess water through flooding, for example, or water scarcity through drought. Wouldn't it be great if we had a drought adaptation plan that was long-term in nature, or a water and flooding adaptation plan like a drought smart or a water smart plan, fashioned after kind of the Fire Smart concept. You know, we know that stakeholders know their local region. They have an intelligence about their own personal and local region far better than most experts, government included, or academics, because oftentimes they're perceived to be further away. So the local knowledge is incredibly important. And, you know, I was fortunate with PFRA to work with farmers, but I live in a city. So, you know, I'm not a farmer myself. And when you're dealing with stakeholders that come at a problem from different perspectives, you think about the problem differently. And then you start to apply your piece of the puzzle as a solution in combination with their pieces of the puzzle. And I think that that's what's so important. And I would really encourage people to consider those kinds of engagement practices with sometimes those partners that, or maybe even opponents that you don't necessarily agree with, because you will gain new insight from all kinds of diverse perspectives. And in that sense, I think we opened the door, and I think a lot of skepticism that the rural communities that we went to and the regions that we went to weren't that far away, but they were outside the power centers, the political power centers. And they would always have a favor for local government, and usually a disfavor for provincial government, and perhaps a strong disfavor for the federal government, depending on where they sat. And that was usually because they perceived those people to be too far away in distance, or possibly not practical enough with a solution. But the fact is, we were all together in those meeting rooms having these discussions and building those relationships, and that was what was fun and actually very valuable.
So I think that's a great example of the breaking down of silos that Jocelyn mentioned. You know, you've got your climate people and you've got your emergency management people, and when the two come together, that sort of brings these new insights. And I think that's really, really important in the context of adaptation. So Jocelyn, this was something that was really emphasized from what you explained to me in the process in the Yukon, this idea of combining different knowledge types. Can you talk a bit more about how you approach that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Darrell. It was very interesting to hear about your process there. And Amanda, about all of the fun things that you're doing. You had some good ideas. You know, being a First Nations person, you know, and then also being an academic and being a consultant, I sort of have been had the opportunity to see how different levels view an issue and then approach it. And so with our governments, when I came into this, to me, it was an opportunity to bring the community voice to the government in a way where it wasn't so much about government extracting from community, it was about community giving to government. And in the work that I do, you know, I view myself as like a servant. Like I'm a researcher now. I've just started, well, I've been a researcher for a while, but I'm working so hard to try and explain that I'm not here to extract, to document, to analyze. I'm here to serve my community and to give opportunity and experience for people to realize, awaken to a different way, the possibilities. And so in bringing people together from these different knowledge bases and then giving them the opportunity to speak with truth and safety, and then for the government people to hear their truth within safety, and then to allow the government people to also speak with their truth as well, was very wonderful, because in so much of the planning we do, it's very superficial. We don't come down to the truth of our hearts and our very real souls that we choose to walk without so often. And so bringing heart and soul to our space was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it created really, really amazing conversations. So yeah, I was very focused on the people within the government and less focused on my community people. But I was focused on them as well, but I guess like the approach was a little bit different in very much that it was about creating relationships and creating teaching and learning and shared experience opportunities. The other thing too in the different knowledge systems is that many consultation processes, and it sounds like Amanda and Darrell, you guys are working really hard on different modes to get different knowledge systems, and I'm so stoked to hear that, because many, you know, standard I guess approaches where you're trying to learn from people are so limited in how the type of knowledge that they're accepting of, or already very targeted in the type of knowledge that you're wanting to extract. And often it's very tangible or logical, linear knowledge. And I really, your puzzle metaphor was quite good, Darrell, in thinking that, you know, climate change is a result of the imbalance and like whole sickness of our planet. And you know, in many of our stories, we have stories about people who took too many animals from one place where they shouldn't have done that, and it threw that place into an imbalance because there was reasons why that certain number of animals needed to stay there. And so to pay for that imbalance, sometimes they paid by exchanging whole tracts of land, by life, sometimes giving life, like taking life. And it was a very heavy wrong to throw a piece of land into imbalance. But now we've been operating at such imbalance for so long, and we're so terribly burdened by it as people, because I think that we know this wrong, and that's where the outcomes, such of an anxiety, inequity, you know, mental health and well-being are all of us suffer from. I do not think there are many of us that walk whole, content, peaceful lives every day, and I'm sorry for that. But I do know that harmony and peace, equality, you know, and equalness in your whole being is achievable, but it requires knowing the land. It requires knowing the spirit of the tree, who are alive, they have memory, and they are dependent on the movement of the air for their own agency to breathe. And so if the air is turning tumultuous, then the tree feels that. And if the tree feels that, I do think that we feel it as well. So like, I guess creating space for conversation like this to be okay is half our battle, because we don't believe we're trained from the time we hear that Santa's not true to not believe in possibility, not believe in the validity of our hearts and our souls as valid in decision making and in planning, especially in resilience and adaptation planning. How can we be resilient as a half person? And so that was what a lot of the conversation was about. You know, I opened and we created safe space. We're speaking of possibility, and speaking with heart and truth and soul was okay. And then the one thing that we did that was quite interesting was we brought in some knowledge keepers, and we went through I guess a very short story from an elder who's no longer with us, but that was documented, that spoke a little bit to the relationship and stewardship obligation with the land. And we had two elders, and one was a descendant of the elder, discuss what this passage meant to them with Yukon government department heads, leadership, senior leadership, and just discuss what it means in terms of resilience and planning but no, not resilience and like whole living and what we can do today for our children tomorrow. And I'm very pleased to say that the department heads, it was just like a seed. And now they're like, more. Can we have storytelling for our departments? Can we learn? Can we have this space for our technical people, so when they go and measure the creek, they can maybe know the spirit of that creek and the story and the history that went with it, because the history is long and deep, and it might roar in a certain way for a certain reason, because perhaps a rock upstream is a little bit sorry for something that happened in the past. You never know. But if we're only measuring how loud it roars, how can we ever have any feign to understand why? So I think that being open to different knowledge places and seeing the validity of the knowledge in the process is half the battle. And so that's why much of what I did was very focused on the decision makers as opposed to the stakeholders.
I love that you actually saw how you were able to kind of light the spark of interest in them to learn more. I mean, that just shows the value of creating these spaces for this type of conversation, as you said, and you spoke so beautifully about what that can offer us in terms of thinking about resilience. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing those perspectives to all of you. I do have one more question for you, and I'm loving this conversation, but I'm conscious of the time, and I know we do have a number of questions coming in on the Padlet. So what I may do now is hand it over to Cameron, who's going to send a few questions, and if we can ask Amber to come back in, that would be great. And Cam, if you don't mind directing a few questions, and then we'll see how we're doing with time. And if we have time, we can maybe ask that last question that I was planning. Thanks so much, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks, Angie. And thanks to all the panelists. I've been kind of on the edge of my seat for the last hour, just waiting for another question, another response. So just turning to the audience questions in the panel. Sorry. I wanted to also give Amber just an opportunity to kind of share any thoughts she might have kind of after listening to the panelists. Amber, yeah, sorry, not to skip you.
No, that's fine. I just, first of all, wanted to thank all of you for sharing what you've shared. It was wonderful listening to the really, really beautiful and creative and inclusive things that you've been doing in your processes. So I learned a lot. Thank you so much for that. I think I took a lot of notes as you were speaking, all of you, but I think one of the kind of threads that I see through your different presentations is this importance of listening, but listening in different ways. So the value of stories, the value of photos and visual ways of representing people's experience, And I think this is something that's such an important step towards moving away from merely seeing, because of course I work in the area of climate disasters and how those affect people. So that's where my mind goes. And I think there's a tendency to see that so often as like quantifiable losses and technical solutions. And I think thinking and including really diverse perspectives and voices through these different ways of listening is one way of maybe getting to what I really like what you said, Jocelyn, of hearing what actually matters. And I know in my own research, we've heard stories of, you know, the things people have lost. It's the trees, it's things like wedding albums. You can't put a dollar sign on those things, but those are the things that matter. Those are the things with meaning and with a very different and I think more important kind of value. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight that. I think it leads us to thinking about what we can learn, what we can then implement. And I think it gets us thinking about a different kind of loss and hopefully a different kind of support, one that's focused on mental health, perhaps, on supporting people through losses, and hopefully in culturally safe ways as well. So thank you all. This has really got me thinking, and it relates to things I've heard from participants in my own research as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Amber. I just want to send out one last reminder to the audience members to please join us in the Padlet. If you post your questions there, we'll be able to pose them to the panelists today. So our first question is a question maybe about the process itself. And so maybe I might ask each panelist to weigh in for it. But it's just asking that a good engagement process takes time, whereas climate change is an urgent problem. So how do we reconcile the need for a good process with sufficient deliberation and the need to make decisions and implement strategies now? Maybe I'll toss it to Darrell first, seeing he's kind of top in my screen here before seeing if any of the other panelists want to weigh on this one.
Sure, Cameron, and I guess I would say that you need to make and take the time to truly engage, and it's about building those relationships, trust and respect, and actually working together with ongoing activities. So it requires listening, it requires action, it requires ongoing friendship, it requires collegial sharing. There's no way we can create urgency by yelling at people to do something now. We need to figure out how to do it together, and we're not good at that. We're creating a polarized world right now that we need to break down these types of barriers. When we met, we expected to get opposition to climate change in Saskatchewan. We expected that we would not have people that even believe in it. We didn't use the term so much about climate change. Instead, we talked about climate variability. Everyone could relate to a natural disaster. And we didn't have to debate the issue scientifically or through opinions. We said, how does it affect you? And how do you want your government to work with you? And how do you want to interact with your government? This requires a dialogue. A dialogue is two-way and circular. It's not top down, it's not bottom up, it's together.
Thanks, Darrell. Jocelyn, do you have any thoughts on this question? Yeah, Jocelyn, I think you're muted, sorry.
When you came on, it went like full screen and it went over my yeah, I wish we didn't plan so much. I wish there was a lot more doing and experiencing and enabling to like giving agency and capacity and skill to people. I believe that is one of the greatest things that we need, and this also goes with some of my thinking about being, you know, we're so mind dependent. Planning is an intellectual exercise largely, and you know, and I'm speaking about how I'm trying to make it a heart and soul exercise as well. But at the bottom line of it all, with climate change, I believe that one of our biggest challenges or risks is our large dependency on like the system, our societal systems at large, and so the computers, like power, like. And one of the things I keep saying here is if like the lights go out and the trucks stop running, like what are we going to do? And what we need is our connections, but we also need capacity to be able to do with our hands. We need to be able to sew, grow, build. And the fact that we devalue that as a personal skill is just one of the greatest detriments to our society. And in turn, we also miss out on the fulfillment that comes with being able to do for ourselves. That creating is such a beautiful thing to do. And now we only create with our minds, but when you're being artistic and you're using your hands, you know, you create as a whole. You put a piece of your soul into that. And it's very, very detrimental, I think, to us as a society that we don't do that. And so, you know, I talk about, like, I'm a part of it, obviously, but in the work that I do in trying to share stories, and especially the old stories and the old history, to the fact that resilience was about being able to survive off rabbits. And rabbit fur is no good for nothing. And but there are people in times of hardship that they made it work. And could we do that today? No. Are we privileged and luxurious enough that maybe we don't have to do that? Yes, but you know, I think that we need to really think harder. So in a lot of my engagements, I do try and give skills sometimes. So I try and do things where people can collect medicine, or they can, like, I just give them like knowledge to try and help their day to day. And what sometimes even that's just like healing, like I told you today, that, you know, peace and contentment is possible, and like, that's something that I can give to you that I hope helps you with your day. But so I think planning, this is again where it needs to be less about extracting and more about giving. And I think that as people in control of creating space for others, it's our responsibility to recognize that that is part of the task as well.
Wow, thank you. Yes, definitely. Amanda, any thoughts from you?
So many thoughts. But yeah, those, Darrell and Jocelyn, those were both just amazing answers, and I wish we were together so we could share for so much longer. And yeah, and that piece around, we need to be taking action, like we hear that so much. And so I think how we have two parts. So how we have been approaching our conversations around engagement. We're doing a huge long planning exercise, absolutely. But we still are taking action during that, and we're looking for piloting approaches and moving forward on things as we do that long engagement process. But we're also thinking about engagement not as that it's only reaching this goal of doing this deliverable, but this is a long-term conversation. That the more that we have these deep conversations and we come as our full selves and create a space for vulnerability, that we can then really set the foundation, the roots for making sure that we're planning for the future, and not just in like the planning cycle, but actually thinking through the generations, what we're going to be needing. And I think that, like, you know, people who work in adaptation, we're all about connections. Like, it's interdisciplinary. We're trying to think as the full picture. And our team has described our work as really like, we're very much focused on doing the knitting. So, you know, we as the province have a goal of establishing the strategy, but our ultimate goal is building resilience in BC. So if we approach all of our work trying to do our knitting and creating connections and creating space for dialogue and people making their own changes, then hopefully we've also fed that broader work across the province, and so not just achieving our goals.
Maybe just in the just to move things along before we run out of time, Amber, there's kind of two questions here that I want to combine to get your thoughts on. So the first is just asking if you have any other resources about similar to the recommendations you shared in your final slide. And then the second question is asking about how to kind of make engagement of diverse voices during kind of the COVID-19 era, and on an online sense that might be a little bit more, there may be more barriers there.
Yeah, those are both really good questions. On the first question, there are some really good pieces of advice and handbooks. One that comes to mind that may be applicable is one that was produced by CARE. There's a handbook on participatory engagement processes. So yeah, there are some good sort of tips out there. There's also the academic literature on participatory research. If one feels like venturing into that, there's lots of really good published work on that. And you know, communities themselves are producing lots of really good advice on how to do, well, community engaged research, but also community engaged participatory processes. So there's some, if that person would like to get in touch, I can probably send an email full of good resources to follow up. I think on the second question, yeah, I mean, COVID has definitely made things challenging, and it has put, while at the same time, I think it's expanded accessibility in some ways. I've certainly not seen as many people on webinars as I have recently since COVID. It seems like in some ways our events are becoming more accessible, but in other ways it's becoming really difficult to connect. And I don't really have an answer, but I think where my mind has been going lately is about the importance of maybe slowing down. And I think when that comes to climate change and to planning, and this goes back to I think what Jocelyn was saying as well, you know, speed has gotten us into this mess of climate change in the first place, rushing into projects that have been environmentally damaging. And you know, maybe it's not necessary that we approve that major extractive development right away. Maybe it's more important that we slow down and have the conversations and do the listening that we need to do first. And I wonder if COVID hasn't, in a way, reminded us perhaps of the importance of slowing down and listening and taking the time and thinking about what that connection means now that we no longer have that connection in the same way. So I apologize, that's not a real answer, but maybe something that we could all think about.
No, thank you. There's a question here asking, how do you incorporate novel engagements, for example, the arts and the conversations that took place in BC, into meaningful changes in the plan itself? So kind of taking these different kind of knowledge sources and these different ways of meeting people and putting the findings from those into the plan. So maybe I'll ask the panelists to weigh in this one in reverse order. And just to flag, we're coming up on kind of the 5-minute mark. So if you could keep it short, I would be greatly appreciative. Amanda, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have so many, but I'm going to keep it short. That I think what was important for us in doing that is that we haven't separated out the role. So the person who is developing the policies is also this person in part of the engagement. So I'm very much part of that policy writing process, but I'm also very embedded in all of our engagement and have been there listening. And so I think that's a key to this, that when we break apart those processes, there's going to be really important information that's lost in there.
Thank you. Jocelyn?
Yeah, we are just in the process of writing, and so it's interesting that you asked that question because we're sort of grappling with it. But I do think in lots of the work that I do, like I try and really like elevate the youth and elder voice, because especially young people, like and trying not to talk or present with all of like the jargon or like superficial speak. And like, so I think there needs to be a balance between like words that are like saying what needs to be said, but then like words that are like digging deeper into how we can, and into sharing this message. And often though, like the good way to do that is with quotes, particularly quotes from young people, because I just think that they hold more authority in this world than anybody else.
Thank you. Darrell?
Thanks, Cameron. I want to thank Amber, Jocelyn, and Amanda. This has been a wonderful session. Thank you for all your wonderful insights. I went to Adaptation Futures 2018 in Cape Town, South Africa. The best session was a session on theater, and the theater was showing how we work and don't work together by role playing. We need to incorporate more arts like that show where we're falling down. It wasn't done in a way to criticize, but it allowed the audience to say, okay, people played their standard roles and did their standard things. The researcher did this, the government guy did that, the mayor did this, the activist did that. It was all archetypal characters that everyone can relate to. And then they went through the play. It was only 2 or 3 minutes, and they went through the play a second time, asking people to interrupt and suggest improvements. It was a wonderful community engagement. We had about 200 people in the room. It was so animated. The next door thought we were actually fighting, and they came in to see if everyone was okay. We weren't fighting, we were just having a good time. The point I'm making here is theater and arts are essential for us to see ourselves. Let's incorporate that, and let's incorporate the motion to act.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to turn the presentation or the webinar today back to Angie, just to see if she has kind of any last questions or comments for the panelists. Angie?
I don't think I can add anything to this conversation, and I'm just so glad we're recording it so I can go back and listen because there was a lot to absorb. But I just want to sincerely thank all of you, Amber, Jocelyn, Amanda, and Darrell, for sharing your insights and your experiences. I think it's been just a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate it. And also want to thank participants for working with us as we tested out this new tool of the Padlet. Very happy to see there's been some engagement there. So yeah, just glad that you could all be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Angie. So I just want to end today first by saying thank you to Angie for organizing this session, but to Amber, Jocelyn, Amanda, and Darrell for sharing their experiences. As Angie said, we have recorded today's event and we'll be posting it along with the presentation from today on our website at prairiesrac.com. Following this event, we'll be distributing a short evaluation survey in a different browser tab, and we would very much appreciate if you could fill out the survey. It should only take less than 5 minutes, and it really helps us to inform our future events. A link to this survey will also be sent out in a follow-up email. One final plug, our 4th and final session in the webinar series is taking place on February 24th, and it will focus on enabling the implementation of adaptation plans. So continuing on the conversation we had today then, and we would very much look forward to having you join us for that session. Thank you everyone for your participation today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.